right, welcome back to The Empire Never Ended. Kookiest Croats in the world. Episode 2.
I don't think this will be the kookiest one. Actually, this one's going to be kind of, I think, on the more boring end of the spectrum.
Oh, no.
In terms of what's to come, at least.
Oh, I see. Okay.
In that, like, the really, like, the kooky, like, violent, crazy shit is going to come. But yeah, there are some, I guess, kooky Croats involved in this episode as well. Yeah. Because I think, okay, so last week when we left off, and I apologize to our listeners, I'm getting over being sick, so if my voice sounds weird, that's probably why. Or if I break out into coughing, also, don't be surprised.
What about singing?
Yeah, I am definitely known for breaking out into singing. I'm like a regular, like, Gene Kelly on this show.
That's right.
Yes.
I'm known for that.
Step dancing as well.
Yeah, well, you know, maybe there would be like a tap dancing Ustashe number here if if we were really going kooky.
That's like the one form of dance that an audio podcast could actually use. You know what I mean?
That's true. Yeah.
That and like clog dancing, maybe.
Yeah, it's audio dancing.
Yeah, it's oral.
I could kind of see like a fascist tap dancing number. Couldn't you? You know what I mean? Like,
it's harder for me to see like a non-fascist tap dancing number.
We're fighting for Croatia.
It's very order. It's very, order and noise. Tap dancing.
So yeah, I guess last week when we left off, things weren't going super smoothly for the Ustashes after World War II, despite, having their entire leadership escape intact and, setting up bases all around the world. It definitely seemed like it was starting to fracture there a little bit in the 50s, to put it lightly. And
I mean, losing the Second World War is a big deal.
Yeah, that doesn't help. Not getting executed by the partisans was a pretty big deal for them.
Yes.
And that gave them a little bit of energy once they, got to Argentina and Australia and the US and Canada and Syria and whatnot. But I guess in today's episode, we're going to try to wrap up Pavelic's kind of pathetic life and career and talk about kind of what was going on the political end of the struggle. Because I think after this, more or less, we're going into the more radical kind of militant groups. So it's going to kind of, I think, more or less be terrorism in some form or another from here on out. So yeah, let's take it back to where we left off last week. And Pavelić was facing a relatively unprecedented rebellion in his ranks. Of course, there were many causes of this rebellion. Some of it stemming from resentment over money, which we talked about a little bit. Pavelić got all that Ustashe gold, was living pretty large, had a pretty privileged position as an advisor here and there to Perón's government in some sort of kind of security capacity, living large off that money. But then, of course, issues surrounding the Catholic Church, that proved to be a pretty big problem for them, and some political disagreements, namely the Stojedinović-Pavelić agreement. And, kind of while we're at that real quick, I'd like to bring up something that I saw in the academic work of this guy, Mate Nikola Tokic, which brought up a kind of interesting observation about the meeting between Pavelić and Stojedinović that I haven't really seen written about much elsewhere.
Should we just quickly recapitulate what that meeting was about?
Go ahead.
What year was it exactly?
Fuck me.
Okay. Early 50s, I guess, or maybe. Yeah, so Ante Pavelić, the leader of the Ustashes, and Milan Stojedinović, who was one of the most important Serbian and Yugoslav politicians of the monarchist Yugoslavia. Met. Both of them were exiled and lived in Argentina. And they met. It was kind of a ridiculous thing because both figures were important at some point, but were completely out of power and without any hope of getting into power anytime, really. But they made some kind of an agreement as if they were the leaders of a Serbian and Croat nation and agreed on how they will, divide Yugoslavia between Croats and Serbs and something like this. And this was, of course, for both sides a very controversial meeting, because Milan Stojadinović, he had this image in the 30s of being a pro-fascist politician or pro-Axis at least, but meeting Ante Pavelić, who was like this now, really notorious enemy now of the Serbian people who, they did this huge genocide, and it was kind of a ridiculous thing to meet him. And then, of course, on the Ustasha side, this was also controversial, and Pavelić was criticized for meeting Stojadinović. And there were different theories why that meeting happened. One is that Stojadinović was actually working for the Yugoslav communist or Titoist state security because he was trying to help his brother, who was a prisoner in Yugoslavia at the time, get better treatment, and that this was a way for the Yugoslav state security to discredit Pavelić and create problems for him in his community. So that's one theory that I know of.
So this is the theory that I'm actually that I saw brought up by this in this academic work of this guy Mate Tokic, and namely, according to him, and this is very interesting. I really didn't know about this before. Like I'd read before that it was a Yugoslav state security project to discredit the both of them. And if that is true, I mean, it worked because it had a big effect on Pavelić's movement, at least. Stojadinović didn't really have the same kind of...
Yeah.
He didn't have a movement behind him in the same way that Pavelić did, but it had a really negative effect on Pavelić. But what this, what was brought up in this text is that the meeting itself was facilitated by a prominent member of the Yugoslav Argentine community, this guy Josip Subasic, who was, very much. He was kind of a businessman involved in publishing, involved in all kinds of, different, side business quests in Argentina, but was very much like a pro-Yugoslav, a pro-communist even, in the local community, a supporter, for example, of the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, vocally so, and I think sent money and aid, and was a close friend and ally of another kind of prominent Yugoslav Argentine of Montenegrin origin, Eduardo Vuletić, who was the former general secretary of Argentina's CNT, Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, trade unionist. And the story here is that the leftist Yugoslavs in Argentina used Subasic to infiltrate Ustashe emigre circles in order to arrange this meeting with Stojadinović and thus discredit Pavelić in the broader emigre community. And this is something that...
In the broader emigre community or among the Ustashes?
Both. Because, like I mentioned,
I would think that in the broader community he would be already.
Well, he was already discredited, yeah. But but they were starting to already establish networks and they had support of the state, so they had their own cultural centers and this, that, and the other thing, and this was kind of supposed to put like a nail in the coffin forever of the Ustashes and destroy whatever influence they had in Argentina and around the world. And I mean, this question of Yugoslav state security infiltration is something that's going to come up kind of again and again as we talk about the Ustashes, because alongside this, for example, which that does actually kind of sound feasible to me. the question, of course, being, why would Pavelić even agree to meet with this guy Subošić? Like, it doesn't make any particular sense to me. But again, I don't know really like the context of the situation at the time. But like, if that was a Yugoslav state security op, it worked very well. But this idea of their infiltration is going to come up, right? Because one thing that we're going to see now, like later when we talk about these more militant groups, is that the accusation of like Yugoslav state security involvement in even the most radical Ustashe groups comes up again and again. Because, there's this idea that that they helped set up some of the more radical groups in order to have like a real enemy on the outside, right? And also to control kind of the most radical wing of like Croatian nationalists. And also to discredit them by, because these guys do like straight up terrorism against civilians and the like, and it works well for the Yugoslav government. So this is something that we're going to see over and over again. But I did find this particular story to be pretty interesting and somewhat compelling, honestly. Again, I would be very curious to know how and why these guys like Subošić or Eduardo Vuletić were able to even connect with these Ustashes who, by all accounts are they're completely insane, very paranoid, hate communists. So how did they let pretty prominent left-wing Yugoslav, Croat, Argentine guy into their midst and allowed him to facilitate this meeting with Stojadinović is not clear to me, but I kind of believe it, honestly. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I mean, it's possible for sure. It sounds a bit. I mean, it's a bit elaborate. Like maybe killing him would be more kind of a state security thing. Like,
right?
They were able to infiltrate his surroundings by just not kill him. But yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, well, especially since killing is something that they did quite enthusiastically with a lot of these guys, including Luburić himself gets offed by in a pretty spectacular way by Yugoslav state security. I think they stabbed him 47 times or something. Like this one of those typical kind of cold weapon executions. Nevertheless, I think it's a very interesting story, even if it's not. Even if it wasn't directed by Yugoslav state security and was kind of an initiative of local, Yugoslav Argentines, it's a pretty interesting and ambitious project of theirs. Because it definitely had a major effect on Pavelić, right? So he was not doing well in the early 50s, and what does he do next, right? How does he try to salvage his movement? He had established a government in exile, right? But by the mid-50s, it was pretty clear that he was losing out to his rivals. On the one hand, many of his most loyal officers, such as, of course, Luburić and his former vice president, Džaferbek Kulenović, had already, sided with other organizations, namely Luburić's kind of more militant Croatian National Resistance, which he founded in 1955. And on the other hand, you have Branimir Jelić's Croatian National Council, which we talked about last week, which was attracting, we characterized it as moderate Ustashe, which is, kind of a contradiction in terms, right. But that's how they, kind of at least tried to present themselves.
Well, Jelić, like you last time you explained that he was an old Ustashe leader, but was not a part of the Pavelić regime during the war, right?
Right.
He was imprisoned or something?
Yeah, he was a prisoner of war. I mean, he was imprisoned even before the war started. He was arrested by Western powers for his involvement with the assassination of King Alexander.
Yeah.
And thus he was never tainted by being part of the regime, and yet still had these bona fide Ustashe credentials, right? As like a member of the original movement, et cetera, et cetera. So people that maybe were trying to distance themselves from, inconvenient little things like the Holocaust and genocide and all this other kind of stuff could kind of look to his organization as one of being like true Ustashas, standing up for, the Croatian movement and the Croatian state, but not, tainted by the horrible, horrible things that they did. Jelić's organization, like I mentioned last week, was attracting this kind of intelligentsia, the clergy, and including figures such as like Ante Pavelić, who became an associate of Jelić's group and edited his own newspaper that was kind of associated with Jelić's Croatian National Council out of Italy, where he was living. And he's a very, very interesting figure that I've been meaning to talk about for a while. I mean, I think I do remember that we mentioned him briefly in ARC 2, but he's a kind of a unique guy for the Ustashe movement. Ray, maybe you could tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, Ante Pavelić is a very weird case. He was like a very prominent Yugoslav communist in the 20s and 30s. In Yugoslavia, he was a part of the so-called left faction of the Yugoslav party, which was the faction that, it named itself and called itself the left faction. But that was the faction that supported the so-called national liberation movements. So he had a connection with nationalism even as a communist. But he also lived in the Soviet Union, and there he was associated with Trotsky's left opposition. He knew Trotsky personally, ended up in a gulag, somehow managed to survive that, get out of the Soviet Union, and in the late 30s, still as a communist, but now like a very anti-Stalinist one, of course, with his personal experience in gulags, wrote a book about one of the first accounts, especially from a communist perspective, of Stalinism and repressions and the gulag system and so on. I think this book was published in many languages. It exists in English. I think it's called The Russian Enigma or something like that in English. And he's like, at the time he was still like a communist critique of Stalinism. And then, but about the time when the Second World War started, he kind of gave up on Marxism, I think, but was arrested by the Ustashe regime and put in the Jasenovac concentration camp and spent there, I think, a year. And then he was taken out of that, and he started collaborating with the Ustashe regime, writing in some kind of more intellectual newspapers that they had, and then kind of shared the destiny of the Ustashe regime, went with them out. I think even during the Second World War, he was stationed in Berlin, in like Nazi Berlin, and I think even lived in the Croatian or the embassy of the independent state of Croatia there, and then just stayed in the West after the war. So he's a very weird case. He wrote there is like a part of his autobiography is a long chapter that's also sometimes published as a separate book about Jasenovac, and he wrote about the horror of what Jasenovac was, but it's also like a very anti-Semitic text at the same time. But he was critical of a concentration camp run by Ustashas, and said it was far worse than anything he experienced under Stalinism in the gulags and such things. But then also kind of as a Croat nationalist, remained aligned with, I guess, parts of the Ustashe movement as well, although tried to have some kind of a critical stance towards them, I guess, in some way. He's one of those people who kind of said that, the Ustashe state should have been reformed in a more democratic direction or something like that. He was a promoter of like Croatian independence, but as a democracy later on. But he was also kind of a special case because for many Westerners, it was unknown that he basically aligned himself with the Ustashe regime, and they still viewed him as a leftist critique of Stalinism and continued to publish his leftist books. And at the same time, he would write in French and other languages like kind of lefty text, but then in Serbo-Croatian, he would write these very nationalist Croatian, anti-Yugoslav, anti-Serbian text. So he had a kind of a double identity there. So, and because of that, like for example, his book about the Soviet Union was, I think, later on published by the French publisher who was close to the Situationists, for example. And Ante Ciliga is like cited by Guy Debord in the Society of Spectacle a few times. He was known as a, they saw him as a communist critique of Stalin, like an early one. And then I think he lived very long. He managed to see independent Croatia in the 90s being established by Franjo Tudjman. And when he was already, I think when he was 92 or something like that, he came back to Croatia. And I think was given a medal by Tudjman or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then he died.
Yeah, it's a really interesting history. Because his left critique, he was kind of situated kind of in some almost kind of left communist circles in Paris, right, when he was living there. And then to basically become an Ustashe, and they write about him quite fondly, right? When you read anything that from the time, they always hold him up as this example of a guy who used to be a communist, but came around and saw the kind of the naivete in his ways and whatever, and came to embrace Croatian nationalism. But they also do always say that he advocated for a more democratic model. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where I guess he fit into Jelić's organization kind of more broadly, is that it had room for all these other different currents that weren't necessarily tied to the Nazism of the Ustashe regime, right?
Well, yeah, because Ciliga, although he was aligned with some of these Ustashes, he also very much hated Ante Pavelić and wasn't shy about that. And he said that, his rule and what he did, I think he also meant, the genocide, the concentration camps and so on, really kind of destroyed the possibility of independent Croatia or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, but that does give you kind of an idea of what these divisions actually looked like, right? In the sense that, there was some sort of kind of broader ideological affiliation even within this kind of really radical Croatian, Ustashe really ideology. Yeah. And Ciliga kind of represents an interesting turn there, right? Because he's very different from the rest of them, both in his origins and even in his political beliefs later on, right? Being kind of actually pioneering a little bit this democratic model that later a lot of them would embrace, including kind of Pavelić himself. So Pavelić, despite being a complete monster from a human perspective, did still have an ability to run an exile-based political group. Despite not having much luck with his state-forming or states' rights political party that we talked about last week, that he founded after arriving in Buenos Aires in 1948, in 1956, he decides to go back to, let's say, the basics and restructure his global network under a new umbrella organization called the HOP, or Croatian Liberation Movement.
Wait a minute. Is that what that Aziz song is about? That's very disappointing.
Oh, man, yeah. Deep cut there.
Thanks.
That is one of my favorite Aziz songs.
Yes. And videos.
For those of you unfamiliar, look up Aziz Hop. You'll be very pleasantly surprised to see a lot of
You're welcome.
Men, a lot of muscled men in
don't spoil
different states of undress, rubbing each other. It's great. It's a great song. Yeah.
Although unaffiliated with the Ustashe, maybe we should clarify. If you're,
no, this is like a Roma singer from Bulgaria.
Right. Yes.
I guess pretty high up on the list of people that the Ustashes would. A gay Roma singer from Bulgaria.
A fabulous gay Roma singer from Bulgaria.
Yeah, definitely high up on the like Ustashe hit list. I'd imagine. Yeah. Not somebody that they would particularly love. But if you look at the very name, right, the Croatian Liberation Movement, the idea was to kind of bring back the old revolutionary nationalist character that was, a crucial facet of the original Ustashe exile organization in the 1930s. So, Pavelić saw that guys like Luburić were having success in channeling like this old school revolutionary militancy with his group Resistance, and that Jelić was having more success with the legit mainstream Croatian National Council. And so the idea was to kind of bring everything together under one organization, right? And in that sense, like kind of serve all tendencies, and like within the kind of broader movement. By the broader movement, I kind of mean here the Ustashe movement, but they kind of saw it as this like broader thing. And because like I don't know, it's important to mention that these like the divisions that grew in the 1950s that we talked about last week weren't like naive little squabbles. You know what I mean? Like these people, all of them are like huge psychopaths, lunatics, genocidaires. Yeah. So, like Pavelić is like, when these splits started to happen, Pavelić and his guys had like a kill list of traitors, like, and kind of knew exactly what they were going to do with these guys once they get their hands on them, for betraying, their Führer. Luburić, for example, being based out of Franco, Spain, and having his own resistance organization that was more militant than Pavelić. Pavelić had gotten soft. He was talking about how once they liberate Croatia, they're going to have to open a whole new network of concentration camps just for the traitors, right?
Yeah.
Charming.
Just for the traitors from exile, right? They're going to bring them all back and put them in concentration camps, which, of course, is something that
it's like
Luburić knew quite well, being the architect of, the Holocaust in Croatia.
Yeah, it's like their go-to answer for everything.
What's happening to Ray there?
Oh, what is happening to Ray? Oh, he's like jerking off an invisible ghost. This is amazing.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Better we can see you.
Yeah.
Do you see this?
I see it, yeah.
Oh my god, this is incredible.
I've never seen this before.
I can't keep a straight face.
Yeah, Ray is stuck jerking off an invisible ghost because of some weird fucking video error. There he is.
Okay.
All right,
there
he's
you go.
back. He's back. That was saucy.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah, the Pope would not approve of any of that.
What's going on?
Oh, incredible.
I guess they are real.
Right, so these guys were all like complete psychopaths, right? And so like, they, when they had splits, they meant business, right? They wanted to kill each other for deviating from the path of being a true Ustashe. And so, Pavelić's idea therefore was to be like, okay, the Croatian Liberation Movement is going to represent any and all groups fighting for Croatian independence, wherever they may be and whatever their politics are, right? And the choice of the word movement wasn't accidental either, because he wanted to distance himself from being like an official party like what he had tried to do when he first came to Argentina, right?
Yeah.
By like trying to start a political party. This is like, okay, we're going back to what it was like in the 30s when things were real, when we were an actual militant movement. And of course, like, that means that we're not a political party. Of course, simultaneously, he is running a government in exile. So I don't know how that really adds up to with like the whole movement thing, because he didn't give that up.
Right.
He's simultaneously both the head of government and the leader of a nonpartisan movement. So I don't know. You guys can try to figure that out. I've tried. And importantly also as well is that he characterized this nonpartisan quote unquote movement as also being democratic.
Okay.
Which is a big step for them, right? Like, I mean, we talked a little bit last week about kind of what their politics were in, like in the early stages of the Cold War, which was that, Croatia's firmly on the side of the West in the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
And so now, fascism is no longer, exactly trendy. And so, they're a democratic movement that is there with other democracies. Again, they're holding out on this idea that eventually some great power is going to like smile upon them and, help them come back to power. Much like, how they came to power in the first place.
Yeah.
On the, backs of the Wehrmacht, right? The idea is, of course, this time that like, probably be the U.S. or, the U.S., NATO, essentially, will help them come back. And so they're still kind of holding out on that idea. And so like, this is a democratic movement. And structurally that meant that like, again, it doesn't matter where you are. If you have a group, any kind of group that is fighting for Croatian independence, the Croatian liberation movement will represent you, and thus you'll be represented by like the OG Ustashes, the guys who proved themselves capable of recreating Croatian statedom for the first time since the Middle Ages. Yeah, again, this is super important to them. They bring it up over and over again. So this is their way of kind of, trying to legitimize themselves. And for Pavelić, this actually proved to be a pretty successful move. So like, if in the early 50s, he was really like losing out to his competitors, namely Jelić's organization and Luburić, starting from 55, Luburić's Croatian National Resistance. Just within like a year, he was able to kind of find himself at like the helm of a reasonably powerful like emigre organization.
Yeah.
To the point that like, Western intelligence reports were saying, okay, Pavelić is back. You know what I mean? Like, he was having a hard time, but he's back. You know what I mean? Like he's back in the driver's seat. Like, people that were like, leaving for other groups are coming back.
How did they feel about that though? Was this bad news for the intelligence scene or not?
Well, it kind of depends on how you look at it. I mean, I think that like with, we mentioned it a little bit last week. Like, I mean, once Yugoslavia started to have relations with the West following the split with Stalin, the CIA or like the U.S. government couldn't like officially endorse these organizations, but they didn't do anything to like curb their activities. It wasn't really until later, until like when the new wave started, like this phase 2 that we're gonna enter in next week, like when like indiscriminate terrorism and stuff like that started, that they had to kind of distance themselves from it. I mean, like, of course they helped them settle in the fucking US and Canada,
yeah, right,
and Australia and the like. And I mean, there are even some like CIA reports, which, from like, the very early 50s, which say the same thing, which say the things that you might expect, which is like, there are worse things than having like the Ustashes come back to power. You know what I mean? Like, but again, they have this like they still had this like tainted legacy of being perpetrators of the Holocaust and the like. That didn't make them very officially endorsable, right?
Sure.
That's why when Pavelić tried to like send a Croatian legion to the Korean War, they politely declined, right? Because
I guess they didn't have much to offer. It's not like there were like many Ustashe scientists that can be recruited by Americans or something like that.
I mean, no sciences that are accepted by the general scientific community anyway.
Oh yeah, I mean, we'll get into this like later in this arc, but like one of my favorite Ustashes that I'm gonna like dedicate a specific episode to, the guy that's kind of MK Ultra aligned. Is a scientist, but in some real kooky, weird shit. Like,
all right.
I mean, like auras and like.
Okay.
I got his book, which is like something. It's called like investigations into the aura phenomenon. It's some shit of his that he read in the 60s. So that he wrote in the 60s. So we'll get into that later on.
Excellent.
But yeah, though, I mean, they didn't have like any Werner von Brauns. I mean, like, I mean, we talked about it over and over again in Arc 2. I mean, the Ustashe regime was a complete disaster, right? It was something that could only come to power via the Germans and like was a complete shit show. They had no clue how to govern. Ideologically was a complete nightmare. All they knew how to do was, basically kill people and implode their state.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, they didn't really have much to offer pretty much anyone. And, of course, like, yeah, I mean,
but I guess they were like valuable in the sense of like very motivated anti-communist, maybe
exactly
to keep them around just in case you need them or something like that.
Well, in case you need to murder someone.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that was the whole point of settling them in the U.S. And Canada, right? Was that like, well, of course, they got rid of some of those pesky commies that were there in the U.S. and Canada. And yeah, I mean, like, they are the most militant anti-communists and are very into talking about that, right? Like, any chance you ask, they get, they're like, by the way, we hate communists and we want to destroy communism and Serbo-Bolshevism and Serbo-communism and Jews too, for good measure. And, they're very enthusiastic. I mean, up there with,
Serbo-communism. That's
Serbo-Bolshevism.
Serbo-Bolshevism. It's very special kind of Bolshevism.
Oh, it is.
Well, the Ustashes had to modify their own Judeo-communism to make it Serbo-Bolshevism. I mean, you can't like read any text of theirs without seeing Serbo-communism. It's synonymous with Serbo-Yugoslav communism. It's all the same thing. I don't know how they, what to them Serbian anti-communists were, but certainly because they like talking shit on the Chetniks too, who are ideologically much closer to them. But that's I think all part of the same like many-headed Serbian Hydra or whatever that is their substitute for Jews, I guess. So the Croatian resistance movement, like I said, was primarily supposed to be like a political organization, right? And it's there to represent all these different factions. And so, they did what other political organizations and his government in exile were trying to do already, which was, campaign internationally for the Croatian cause. So like we just mentioned, like they didn't have too much success. And later in this arc, when we talk about the most success that they had, and eventually that ended up being more associated with Luburić's group, was trying to campaign in the Muslim world. But we're going to dedicate a whole series of episodes to that in particular, because that's like a whole interesting tangent. I mean, in that they tried to get the independent state of Croatia admitted to the Arab League, campaigned against recognition of socialist Yugoslavia and Arab countries and the like. They had more success there than they had anywhere else. Although, again, like I said, that's a teaser for what's to come, because that's probably going to be my favorite part of the arc, because it's a very completely forgotten chapter of history. But in this attempt to campaign internationally, they went other places where you might expect, a good anti-communist political organization to go, and that's to Asia, right? So, he didn't succeed in sending his legion to Korea to fight in Korea, but Croatia was an important member of the World Anti-Communist League, which is an interesting organization that is called...
You say Croatia, but I guess it's the Ustashe movement, right?
Yeah, well, they're government in exile, and via this nonpartisan, definitely not connected to any kind of political party movement, broad democratic movement.
Did they have one government in exile or a few?
Well, they had one, but when they split later, the loyalists that to the true Ustashe cause, the guys that stuck with Luburić, for example, Jafar Kulanović, who was the former vice president of the independent state of Croatia, the Ustashe regime, they really picked up a lot of the diplomatic activities, and kind of had their own somewhat government in exile. So yeah, there was only one really official government in exile, but also not really.
Okay.
Again, it gets a little confusing. There's a lot of chaos going on during this time period.
The official government in exile is HOP, right? HOP.
No, the official government in exile is the government in exile.
Okay.
HOP is a nonpartisan movement of people and organizations that advocate for Croatian independence. A democratic organization that represents the interests of Croats all over the world who want to destroy Yugoslavia.
Okay.
It is in no way related, despite, being led by the Führer, Ante Pavelić, to this government in exile.
Okay.
That's just, forget about that. That's one thing. This is another thing. Okay.
Gotcha. All clear.
Right. So yeah, they become involved in kind of bigger worldwide movements like the World Anti-Communist League, which is an interesting organization to begin with. Now it's called, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think now it's called the World Organization of Freedom and Democracy or something.
Yeah, good name. Good name.
But the original world,
fireworks and cheese on burgers.
The original World Anti-Communist League is, founded in Taiwan by Chiang Kai-shek, as this attempt of getting all these embattled, enslaved nations that are fighting communism together. So I think it's founded originally by Taiwan, South Korea, later South Vietnam, and then add and subtract any given regime at the time. In Europe, it's best represented by the Ustashes and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and maybe some other Ukrainian exile organizations as well, along with, of course, other famous, captive nations like Estonia and the like.
Right. I guess they were in Aachen and whatnot.
Right.
The Association of Captive European Nations.
Exactly. Yeah. That network is the European one. Is what the European chapter of the World Anti-Communist League is. Right? Okay.
All right.
It's been described as essentially outside of Asia being nothing but a smattering of neo-Nazi groups.
Yeah.
Cold.
Just a smattering, though.
Right.
A dollop.
that I guess falls under the democratic tradition of this, Croatian resistance movement, right? This is what they're up to politically. The interesting thing about the Croatian resistance movement is that it still exists to this day as an organization, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But what's interesting about it is that since it is an umbrella organization, it is actually hard to kind of attribute specific bad things to it, right? Because it does, because I was looking into, we're talking about Ustashe terrorism in this arc, and the next few episodes are going to be dedicated to very specific acts that they did. And in some way or another, kind of everybody and nobody, they're all kind of associated with the Croatian resistance movement and some liberation movement in some way or another, right? Okay. But at the same time, you can't really attribute a specific terrorist action or group to them, right? In that sense, what Pavelić set up was kind of ingenious, right? Because it does represent all of them, and yet you can't attribute any particular terrorist act to them as an organization. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
However, like I mentioned last week, Pavelić's own reign and life would not last particularly long. So he founds this organization in 1956, and immediately gets back in the driver's seat, is riding really high. Like I said, foreign intelligence are saying, okay, he's back. He's all of a sudden surpassing Jelić's guys, people that were leaving the organization are coming back, etc. But he starts to experience some of his own problems. And some of this I mentioned last week, right? He was having problems with the government in Argentina eventually. Perón gets overthrown in a coup. He is no longer protected in the same way by the Argentine state. But most importantly, on the 16th anniversary of the independent state of Croatia's Declaration of Independence, so on April 10th, 1957, mind you, just a year or so after he founds the Croatian liberation movement, Pavelić is getting off a bus in a nice leafy suburb of Buenos Aires when he is approached by a man, a Montenegrin Serb named Blagoje Jovović, who approaches him and fires a good 5, 6 to 10 shots at him, critically wounding. Right. So he actually doesn't get hit by all of them. I guess some accounts vary, but he got hit at least 2 or 3 times with one bullet kind of critically hitting his spine. So, this guy, Blagoje Jovović, is an interesting fellow. I mean, this might be the only Chetnik that gets any kind of props on TENE Pod. But I guess this is one of those broken clock, right, twice a day kind of situations.
I think we gave Kajević some minor support for learning that racism was dumb,
for learning that racism was wrong. Well, yeah. Okay, so I mean, Blagoje Jovović was a Montenegrin Serb who fought in both the partisans and then later the Chetniks. I think he was a partisan first and then a Chetnik, and definitely kind of was more of a Chetnik than anything else, right?
He was a Chetnik of Pavle Đurišić or something, yeah?
Yeah, I believe so,
Which are also known to have formally at least become part of the Ustashe regime at the end of the war. So that there's that as well.
Yeah. Well, apparently he had been planning this action for a long time, so it wasn't clear for actually, I think, even many decades until he didn't really start talking until the 90s. It was never clear until then whether he had acted as an agent of the Yugoslav state security or whatever. It's pretty clear now that he didn't. He acted completely independently and started very early. I mean, he was tracking, I guess, Pavelić from more or less as soon as he found out that he got to Argentina, because he himself emigrated to Argentina as well. I think pretty much exactly to assassinate Pavelić. It's interesting that his explanation for why he did it. It sounds a lot to me like what that Ukrainian anarchist Sholom Schwarzbard said when he killed Simon Petlura. Who, when he assassinated Petlura, he said, "I've killed a great assassin." He was avenging Ukrainian nationalist pogroms and killings of Jews. Jovovich said, I wanted to kill the greatest butcher of Serbs. I want to avenge Serbian victims, and I did it because I'm a Serb, or whatever. Mm-hmm. It just it reminded me of that, like
that one was a lot more Serby.
It's a lot more Serby than the Jewish anarchist who killed Simon Petlura, but it was this kind of like, I killed the greatest assassin kind of thing. It's almost kind of word for word there when he says, like, I killed the greatest butcher. Fortunately for Pavelić, and I guess not for anybody else, he didn't immediately succumb to his injuries. Instead, he was, hospitalized in Buenos Aires. So at this time period, he'd been kind of living under an assumed identity. And when he went into hospital in Buenos Aires, his identity was, of course, made known, and the Yugoslav government petitioned the Argentine government to extradite him to Yugoslavia to put him on trial, which is something that Yugoslavia had been trying to do for quite some time, right? Like, they had petitioned the Argentine government before to send all these Ustashes to Yugoslavia, and without any success under Perón's government. But now, the situation had changed. And so, for old Pavelić there, he knew that, Argentina wasn't going to be his safe haven forever. And so, while he's recovering in the hospital, he gets smuggled out by his, trusted aides and comrades to Chile, where he spent some time in Santiago. And before he finally gets approved for asylum in Franco's Spain, which, by the way, is where his greatest rival Luburić is also living, except I think Luburić is living in Bilbao, and Pavelić, of course, goes to Madrid. But, even Franco wasn't really willing to risk the consequences of having such a high-profile criminal like doing shit in his country, and gave him asylum under the condition that he would kind of cease his public political life, right? Which is kind of interesting, because if you think back to kind of OG Ustashe history, because they found themselves in exile many times, you'll remember that he had kind of a similar arrangement with Mussolini, no? When he was given asylum in Mussolini's Italy, he was supposed to not publicly, do all this kind of criminal craziness, because, Mussolini was trying to, like, balance their relationship with like the Yugoslav monarchy and the like. And so, kind of history comes back in a kind of interesting way for Pavelić here, because, he finds himself once again in exile in a friendly regime, but one in which he really can't do what he wants to do. And he definitely can't do what he did in Argentina, right? So he's officially, not doing public. He's no longer necessarily the public face of the Ustashe movement. However, I mean, by most accounts, he is still regularly meeting with people. People are coming, flying to Spain to see him, and he is still coordinating stuff. But like on an official level, according to, Franco's stipulations, like you can't be doing what you were doing before, right? And of course, he doesn't live for too much longer after this. So he dies 2 years after being shot. So in 1959, he kind of finally succumbs to his injuries and dies in Madrid, surrounded by his family, his daughter, who kind of continued his legacy, and his wife, and some of his kind of loyal aides. So I guess we can say good riddance to that fucking human toilet at this point.
Yeah, it took long enough.
But he gets like his official burial with honors or whatever in Madrid. So he's dead. But unfortunately for everyone, the Croatian liberation movement didn't die, and it lived on quite well without him. So like I said, I mean, like whatever this like kind of open-ended umbrella structure that he set up seemed to actually kind of work pretty well. And so the Croatian liberation movement gets taken over after Pavelić's death by this guy Stjepan Heffer, which I like his name, who eventually moves the headquarters of the organization to Canada, to Toronto. There is a brief period, I think, where it's also based in the United States, but kind of for most of Heffer's life, at least, it's in Canada. And he runs the organization for many years after that. And it continues, of course, to exist to this day, right? Somewhat surprising. To the point that even a very recent Croatian Minister of Culture under the government, I think, of Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, this guy Zlatko Hasanbegović, was a member of the Croatian liberation movement. That is, he edited a newspaper that was affiliated with the Croatian liberation movement. Like I said, it's this open-ended structure is really brilliant for them because it can really allow all kinds of affiliations. Well, this newspaper is affiliated with them. It's not run by them.
Yeah.
This, that, and the other thing. So, I mean, a guy who was the Minister of Culture in like very modern Croatia was a member of this organization, an affiliate of this organization. So, I mean, that's kind of like, in terms of, a political legacy, Pavelić did finally manage to leave something behind that outlived him, that wasn't dependent on him, and something that, if like, when they tried in the 90s to run as like an official party in Croatia, they didn't do very well, but it's still a relatively powerful force in the Croatian communities in Australia and Canada in particular. So like to this day, I mean, actually just like a month or so ago, I think I put out a thread on Twitter when some American right wingers were giving some sort of presentation at a Croatian community center in Vancouver,
right?
And people were very surprised by this. That Croatian community center is, of course, a Croatian community center that's affiliated with the Croatian liberation movement.
Okay.
Right? It's something that is like, to this day, they have their community centers all over the world that do pretty mainstream things, and you can, organize your wedding and graduation party there at, the Ante Pavelić Hall of, the Croatian Community Center of Vancouver.
Oh, can we?
Yeah, well, if we ever do like a tour.
Oh, Ante Pavelić Center for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. We should try to book ourselves at all of those places, and then all of like the Chetnik centers in like Canada and the US. And see if they take us,
I thought you were trying to like
if
get
this is
some
part
fights
of their broad
started.
democratic tradition, what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the good thing we can say at least at the end of this episode is that Pavelić is dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The bad thing is that he established a long-lasting legacy.
What an asshole!
Unfortunately, it's still part of modern-day Croatian politics. So
yeah, yay us.
Do with that what you'd like.
Yay, all of us.
Yay.
All right, damn.
So the two other organizations, the Luburić one and the Jelić one, do they still exist as well?
The Jelić one, not so much. Luburić, yes, technically, but that's gonna be kind of next week's episode.
Okay.
Is going to be Luburić's organization. Again, they kind of adopted a more open-ended organizational structure. In that, like his group, which is called Croatian National Resistance, or just Resistance, and they call themselves Resistors.
Had a few of those lately on the show.
Yeah. People were able to kind of start their own independent chapters way after Luburić himself was dead. So, there are still guys that claim that name. There's I have this book of Luburić's letters from the 50s up until he died, up until he was killed in the 60s, in 1969. And the guy who published that book is some Croatian Ustashe guy who formed his own chapter of Luburić's resistance in, I think, the 70s. Right. So after Luburić had died, he had just like started his own, militant group in Texas, actually.
Oh, hey, of course. Where else?
So yeah, I mean, like that went on. Jelić's group kind of fizzled out in the 50s.
Oh, okay.
So Jelić himself, I think, survived until like 1972 or something like that. Like I mentioned last week, like he'd survived a couple, Yugoslav state security assassination attempts, and then eventually died kind of suddenly after going on a fundraising trip in the United States, in West Germany, and he died in West Germany. But his organization, despite like being the most promising one in the immediate like post-war period, kind of collapsed by the end of the 50s due to kind of like internal problems, similar to kind of like many things that we've talked about in any of these kind of organizations, right? A lot of infighting, and then it just kind of collapsed, right?
Well, Jelić was trying to do different things. Like at some point, from what I understand, he had like a pro-Soviet position, right?
Oh.
And was trying to align Croatian nationalism with the Soviet Union, which is a thing that I think had a certain legacy. Even if his organization didn't exist anymore, there were people, younger people in that movement who later on had kind of similar ideas or ideas related to that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, once we now get into the second phase of like the 1960s and 70s, especially when we get into like the kind of urban guerrilla movements, very much inspired by like the leftist ones, similar like leftist ones, and some of them also again had these kind of leftist positions. There were like these emigre groups. There was one small faction in Austria, I believe, that called themselves some sort of Croatian Communist Party. That, from what I understand, it was literally two guys. And there's something in a CIA report about it where they're like, these guys say that they're going to like get the Soviet Union to like make a new like Croatian state, but like we don't take them seriously, basically. But that is to be said that there was like there is definitely a left wing of the Ustashe movement that like is pretty prominent in some ways in the 60s and 70s. And then of course coming back to this like whole idea that all of the movements and all of the different groups that we've talked about in this arc eventually come to, which is this kind of reconciliation, whether it's Serbian groups or Albanian groups or Croatian ones. Eventually all the anti-communists accept communists or former communists or whatever as long as they're nationalist enough. Which is how like you get like American Chetniks that support Milosevic, or some of them never did, but some of them absolutely do, or how like Albanian nationalist groups eventually support the KLA, which has like Marxist origins. like Maoist origins or whatever. It's the same thing with Croatia, right? Tudjman, former communist, also member of the World Anti-Communist League, but separate from the Croatian liberation movement. Eventually they all come to this reconciliation or whatever. And that's something that we're going to, I think, have to formulate and talk about a lot more, maybe at the end of the arc, because it's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because they all have this hardcore anti-communist stance until there are communists that are nationalists enough for them to accept it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I guess so. Now we kind of set the stage. We know the Ustashe post-war diaspora scene. We know that there is a government in exile. There is Pavelić's movement. It's trying to be the main one, but he also has competitors. Basically, you could say to the right of him, of followers of Max Luburić, who present themselves as more through Ustashe as more extreme. Of course, Luburić, I mean, the guy who basically orchestrated the Holocaust in the independent state of Croatia, would be more hardcore.
Yeah.
And then Pavelić also has the competitors in a way to the left of him in Branimir Jelić's movement, which is a weird thing that, as you said, kind of disappeared in the 50s, but there was a sort of a legacy of some of those more weird ideas of trying to align Croatian nationalism with Soviet and left-wing politics and so on, which we'll talk about more in the future. So I guess now we know how this scene looks like, and from the next episode on, we'll talk about the actual militant terrorist groups and what they did.
Yeah. It gets weird, guys. Like I said in the last episode, when the CIA guys said these guys mean business or whatever, they really did. There's a lot of killing. There's a lot of bombing. There's a lot of weird shit. Including kind of like press ganging of economic migrants into like these militant organizations and the like. They had a very like strong model on how they did things that like is very different from what you might expect from like 1960s and 70s militant organizations. Like they're a lot more serious in many ways, right?
Yeah.
So we'll get to that next week. Ding dong, Pavelić is dead finally in TENE Pod.
Yay.
Yeah, I just don't feel like he's really gone, though.
Oh,
he's not.
Come on.
I mean,
don't worry.
Look, all these, fucking people are still doing their thing.
The Poglemnik's legacy lives on.
Yeah.
For the rest of this arc.
Alrighty. Well.
All right.
See you in Terror Town.
Yep.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.